Hi, my name is Mikdad Asaria. I'm from the London School of Economics. So this is actually for Professor Mohan. Anecdotally, at the beginning of the lockdown in India, I was hearing from friends that suddenly they had no home help. And life in India was very much, particularly for the middle classes, organized by the home help, whether it's cooking or washing clothes or cleaning or all of those things were completely taken care of. And so they had suddenly had to do these things for themselves, and they had no labor-saving devices. So nobody had washing machines or food processors, or the kitchens they were all very rudimentary because it was very labor-intensive. And suddenly when the lockdown happened, they started having to do these things themselves and investing in various gadgets to make this process more productive for themselves. So I haven't followed this conversation on, but I wonder if beyond the lockdown, how this change in household productivity has impacted those home helps. Have they reduced the number of home help they rely on? Have they, what's been the consequence of that on that informal labor market?
I think the interesting way of looking at it is the intersection of class with caste and gender here. So what you're saying was true of the first lockdown wave when societies, residential societies, most cities had shut down. In fact, RWAs, Residential Welfare Associations, became the new home ministries. They were issuing their own decree and not allowing. There's still, we have images, there's still lifts, like residential lifts that mentioned entry for domestic workers, women of certain waste pickers, and other labor class. So there was a separate entry for that group, and in the next lift, the one lift next to, that's continued, in fact, post-pandemic as well. My sense on the outsourcing of work that happened temporarily was a function of also many care responsibilities shifting to women who were in fact working from the upper class sections and were not clearly willing to do that work, and that put a lot of pressure that we have to change these RW norms, get the domestic workers and others back. It's a complex trajectory. I'm not saying that it's women exploiting women as the tagline, right? If you're trying to I'm just saying that class structures were dependent in cities on the appropriation of that kind of work, which stopped for a period of time. You don't see that really in the Delta wave, which clearly was the worst period. People were cautious, but they realized in the first wave that we can't do this for 3 weeks. 3 weeks is the period of time. So I think it's very interesting to look at what you would find is post-pandemic that's not changed much. If that's the question you're really asking. In fact, I see that as worse because the wages that there was a bargaining power for community workers before, now there's even lesser of that. But there is a conversation now that, well, if you have a situation like this, are you talking about men in the household taking more care responsibilities? I think that conversation has really picked up since that period of the pandemic. So the role of the male, the urban elite male in the household.
I wonder if we could turn that into a question for the panel as a whole, in that, your answer was really interesting, Dipanshu, in terms of what had changed in terms of the labour framework, the gender framework. And I wonder if that is actually a question which everybody could speak to. In fact, what has changed in the context which you've discussed in terms of those questions of the changes that were made during 2020, beginning of 2021, and what the legacy of that is now for labour relations and work, both formal and informal.
So in my personal observation, everything has just become worse through the lockdowns. As I said before, Argentina had already cycles of a lot of different crises, and as such there has been already a sense of a feeling of abandonment by the state, a large mistrust towards government institutions, towards external help as well. And as such, the sense of desperation within the labor market has been already existing for a long time, and lockdowns have exacerbated everything, particularly also with this strong surveillance state that has been introduced. So there's an even greater mistrust really towards the formal sector. At the same time, the informal sector has grown, informal settlements have grown because of the unaffordability of rents, tied also with this massive increase in inflation. And what is interesting about Argentina, though, we have to remember that the majority of the studies come and are focused on Buenos Aires itself, as if Buenos Aires represents the entire country. And it's difficult to really speak for the rest of the country because it has different kind of realities. So from what I've seen from the studies of Buenos Aires, it truly shows, I have to think back of personal experiences when I lived there in 2018. I think I have never seen a city with such a high number of protests on a daily basis. I used to think that London is truly one of the most active places in the world, but in terms of really from the ground up movements, there is a lot of expression. And of course, there were silenced during the lockdown because they could not assemble on the streets, etc. At the end of lockdowns, it has picked up again. There are strong voices for gender-based context, which is really interesting. The feminist movements are very strong in Argentina. And I think it is really, we have to come back to this notion that I personally also find very important with the observations of how lockdowns have been introduced really globally, and I myself, I come from Italy, and I think Italy was also one of the worst countries of how lockdowns have been introduced, that they were so draconian, that in my personal view, the states took too much liberty to extend lockdowns, to impose them the way they did, without really a solid scientific backup. And I think there has been a great degree of silencing also within the medical community. And what we know now, COVID-19 has not been the threat that it was declared to be, despite, of course, tragic numbers of losses. But overall, we do see that it is not comparable to other diseases that have higher degrees of fatality. So we really can see that there were other strategies at play to introduce a greater surveillance state.
About Cartagena in Colombia, I think we have a particular situation in terms of political issues and transition. It's the first time in our history that we have decided a left government in our history of when we started Republican state. And I think this kind of political transition, we have always been governed by right government, neoliberal governments, and also repressive government. And the COVID-19, I think that maybe made visible that the elite, the economic elite, and also the political elite, they could not hide their real interest. So the lockdown was like a time where people with the interest, the privatization, and also the private interests were really putting on the table in a visible way. Because we were suffering the same issues at the same time, but also we realized that why here we are in our community, we are not having access to food in the same way that someone who lives in the other neighborhood. So those kinds of analysis people didn't used to do before. So the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdown and the lack of possibilities to access to food made us reflect about the segregation and the inequality. So at the same time, the government was pushing the tax reform, and people had more time and also to understand what was the impact of the tax reform. And it brought the national strike in Colombia. So we spent 4 months on the streets. So many things happened. Many youth lives were taken by the police. But the change came. The transitional government came, and we took political decisions with awareness of what was happening. Then other things is we also, I think the COVID-19 pandemic in the case of Cartagena, that is a touristic area, data have shown how the 1% of people who accumulate wealth, they keep doing that. So it didn't change. The gap still exists. The gap was noticeable. We could analyze it, and also the poverty was worsened. And it seems like a change happened. Our people died. Yeah, our people pass away. Black and African descendant people pass away because of COVID-19, and that was something that changed. That we don't have the communitarian relation that we had before because our family are not expanded at the same way we used to be because many people die because of the COVID-19. And that kind of communitarian relation is important for African descendant families because of the transmission of knowledge, of cultural and also ancestral knowledge. And when our elders pass away, when most of African descendant women pass away and youth were killed by the police, not by the COVID-19, it was a breaking of the tissue of the family and community, African descendant communities.
See, I'll just say a couple of things if you allow me. This is a platform which I think there are a lot of academics, scholars, and I think the perception or perceiving change depends as a function of where you stand, and where you were 3 years. 3 years is a long period of time, right? Even 6 months is, or even few months is. I felt that predominantly, and I'm speaking for a lot of the researchers, spatially located in urban elite centers and part of the academic research base in social science, did a huge disservice during the pandemic for not locating the agency of where the issues really lied. We left it too much in the hands of, let's say, journalists who were given this responsibility that you go and cover the voices. I say this because when you go on the field and you are talking to members of the community who were aggrieved and affected, not just by economic insecurity or social insecurity or other things, but what's really happening at that period of time, most are saying, first of all, they don't understand the purpose of why an intellectual or an academic scholar is there. There's a huge resentment, at least in India, I would say right now, amongst the academic intellectuals, because there is an inconsequential gain which a respondent doesn't understand, which is to say, why do you want me to speak at this point of time, given this is important for me to as a place of work? So Mazdoor Mandis, right? They just have a natural 45-minute window to find work. And that's the only time you can talk to them. Now, why I'm mentioning this is because it is easy for us to stand in this position and say that the governance system failed. A lot of the social welfare ends. But as responsibility shifts, I think the most secure part of the community who had the jobs secured at that time was also the academic communities as such. We were in a very privileged position at that point of time to not just think, ideate, abstract, and write. And I felt we were still working on the same frameworks and same methodological, theoretical structures that were in place when the whole world is shifting beneath the feet. Everyone was experienced by loss. Everyone, no one was left out. But how you incubated that loss and what you made out of it was something which I felt was a larger question. So I hope that in the next 2 days, we also personalize the conversation somewhere to say what we were in our own limited space. Because we have this opportunity, right, to speak on the behalf of millions and millions of people who were really struggling. And they still are. In fact, they don't really care about the fact that you might want to look at their issues unless there is some capacity building that the person who was interviewing them can be part of. So I think that's a big question because political systems are now increasingly, not just in India, but I'm saying generally with the waning of backsliding of democratic structures of institutional governance, are asking this question that intellectual bankruptcy is becoming almost the norm. There is no, not just within the scientific community, even on economic policy, right? What's really going to be advised for whose care is going to be a big question. So, I mean, what I'm trying to say is academic scholars need to stand up and see what they really do.
Thank you. My question is for Madalena. In your conclusion, you mentioned that the first lockdown was justified because that was a new virus and we did need more time to understand. My name is Van Ding. I come from Vietnam, but most of the time I didn't live in Vietnam. I lived in Europe and right now in America. I call myself a lockdown refugee because we lived in Seattle, and after 2 years of lockdown, we had to run to a free state, Texas. Started from zero. I was also personally affected by the lockdown. My dad fell ill in Vietnam a few days just before the lockdown, and I had to stay away. I couldn't go home when he was ill. When he passed away, when he passed away, I couldn't go home because of the vaccine mandate. Now what I'm really worried is that so we're talking about low and middle income countries, and I learned in your presentation that Argentina already was under last debt before the lockdown, and the lockdown exacerbated the debt. So if we really think that, yes, when there's a new virus, we need more time to understand that, then I'm so worried that the cycle will be forever and ever. And at any time, any state could say, oh, there is something, we need to lock down and try to understand the situation to better prepare ourselves and react. I signed the Great Barrington Declaration very early, and we understand that lockdown is a very exceptional and very inhuman measure, and I think it affects greatly international trade and importations and exportation of a country too. So I'd like to, discuss that and understand more why you concluded.
First of all, my sincere condolences to your late father. So lockdowns are really a reflection of a huge human cost. When I said in the presentation that it seems that the first lockdown seems justified or was justified, is rather a reflection of a consensus by a lot of people who backed it up through the spread of fear that was instilled through the media and others. Fear, as we know now with the data that we have, can also be understood as an acronym that stands for false evidence appearing real. And by no means am I defending lockdowns personally, because I've always found them to be draconian. Of course, it depends also, looking at each country, they had different types of compulsory social isolation measures. No one country had the same application, so I think it's most interesting to look at those countries that had the worst types of lockdowns, where really everything possible was shut down, and where there was an increase in police surveillance and military checkup on the streets and across the country. And what was also very interesting, I find, was all of a sudden this rise of mistrust and natural immunity, which was also very interesting because in the previous years leading up to this pandemic, there has been actually quite a consensus among a lot of doctors and medical representative personnel to consider immunity as one of the most effective most effective approaches to target in the response of different forms of influenza, including different types of coronavirus. So this is interesting, including such an important figurehead that I think was internationally followed, like Fauci, because of course the States has such an influence on the rest of the world in terms of also the decision-making of the lockdowns. And there has been indeed a widespread silence of voices. Back to also the medical approach itself, I think there has been really a censorship also within alternative holistic healing. I also viewed a lot of racism towards, for instance, African holistic medicine that has been ridiculized throughout the media, really, and instead has been actually serving communities very beautifully. And then only maybe a year or 2 years later, also the medical sector was opening itself up to other kinds of pharmaceutical medicines that were lighter in the approach than the ones that were basically imposed also in the treatment of COVID, which is very interesting to see. I will mention one thing because it's a very controversial topic. In the UK, for instance, there was a widespread application of a pharmaceutical medicine called midazolam, which might have contributed to a very sharp increase in the death among the elderly generation, and that could have been avoided having used other kinds of medicine. So this is very concerning as well. And this kind of silencing within the medical community and silencing of political ideas has definitely led to a huge skepticism towards lockdowns. And to the question why did they continue lockdowns and whose agenda is it serving? How could they continue to serve this agenda of the powerful groups? Is really, really interesting because it makes us think of so-called shadow interest groups, right? Who is behind the scenes? And how was it possible that certain measures were introduced the way they were introduced? Now, not in Argentina, but for instance, in Italy, there was the introduction of a green pass. That was a digital control measure of really dividing people of who got a vaccine and who didn't get the vaccine, resulting in a lot of people not having access to a lot of resources across the field, from jobs, risking their employment status, not having access to transportation, not having access to restaurants, bars, etc. And I, in my personal observation, actually see that the majority of the people who have followed the imposition of certain... perfect, of course. I actually went to another type of fear, which was not a fear towards the virus, but the fear towards losing their existential subsistence. So that was also really interesting to see. So I will conclude with the idea that there has been somewhat of a reality that worked in the fashion of dividing to rule. That reminds us of a lot of colonial practices around the world, which basically try to separate communities, increase vulnerabilities and dependence in order to really rule the current pandemic that we experienced. Well, current, not anymore. The last pandemic we experienced.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, just to add to Professor Mohan's unacceptability of the academic or intellectual silence. Basically, of course, living in Africa, of course, coming from Africa, there were things that we interrogated, even the theories around social distancing, you know, in the African setting. In our own setting, where close to 90% of the people live. How possible? How can you isolate? What's the lies around isolation? How possible if you want to follow public health and you leave 10 in a room or 7 in a room, and they say go isolate, and you say oh, isolated, or you live with, you know. So there are issues which are quite big. I really try to lead some group of social scientists to see the applicability of social distancing as an intervention under a particular framework, and whether it should ever be discussed, not to talk about practice. Again, there was still some gang-ups, of course, you know. It took us over a year to lead a publication through with several rejections, over 1 year, over burning issues, because the thoughts were against the normal thoughts. Mm-hmm. Again, it brings us to the domain where the voice of who can speak and be heard is, and the voice who could be silenced in a way. There was this silence, really. It was quite deafening. But the second point is to even see some convergence. I can see Professor Mohan, Professor Eileen in Mexico. The kind of activity that went on within the informal class of people. You know, I talked about the pushback, the people try. I can see it in the informal sector. And we saw in Mexico that, yes, they resorted to protests, several of those. We didn't have protests, but there was this mechanism, survival, that was pushing this pushback, and it's quite large. Nigeria survives with a strong, informal economy. That is where the strength and the engine room of that nation is, and of course, from what we're saying. So I really want to understand. It's not been really said much, but I'm saying it coming up now, that the informal sector, people really who were not able to have the social, caps for survival, really did something else. And I would like to see what happened, because it never appeared there was a lockdown in those places we saw. And that was a big deal of my hypothesis. And of course, we saw a couple of places that they were not really at lockdown. Life had just to go. Life had to just happen the way it was. And maybe that's the reason for many unexplained things that are never in the books, but we are not seeing them now in India, in Nigeria, quite a lot of, in Mexico. So it would be interesting to see in India, those places, how was it managed? Did they get the job, or who was given the job, or how did they support themselves? Thank you very much.
So I live in Germany. I'm Turkish, and I've been following several countries during the pandemic. And I think we haven't seen that much of a polarization in one aspect, I think, although, we witness it in many aspects. I don't know if you'd agree with me regarding your own countries, but yes, there are some people after all the lockdowns who'll go back, and if there's a new lockdown introduced in case of another emergency, they'll be like, yes, now I know what to do, I'm ready to go. But the majority of the population has really lost all of their faith in the whole concept of lockdown. And they wouldn't want to go back to it, and they're much more skeptical, is my impression generally of the countries that I follow. Because after years of it, what they have experienced as distrust of authority, distrust of medical and political authority, but also the reality of their lives, the challenges, the costs, the experience of that cost. So what is your impression of the countries that, your countries?
I hear a lot of reaction or harms of lockdowns in this conference, and they are quite justified. But I think we need to go one step beyond and see why they continued, even if they were so harmful, or all these measures. And I think and I've been hearing it from the speakers when we moved to the panel, because it must be serving to someone else's agenda. Otherwise, things could have not continued. So in that sense, I think the first lockdowns were, in my opinion, justified, but there are different opinions about it. In my opinion, they were justified. Perhaps a lot of the measures could have been justified. But the striking issue is, how could they continue in a way that served to the agenda of the powerful ones? If we can show those mechanisms, how it served to those powerful groups or the elites or whatever, then we have a case. And then we can prevent it to happen in the next time. Because the next time, it may not be lockdowns, but it might be another mechanism. Because during shock situations, this usually takes place. There are measures coming up. There are things happening. And if we show it clearly how it served to the agenda, or it made the low socioeconomic groups even further lower, but how the others gained from it, then we can create a case for other measures in the future crisis. So thank you very much.
My question is basically, who decided, even from the beginning, when in the early months of 2020, that the lockdown was the solution? Like, who's sort of responsible for that? Is it the international organizations? Was it just national governments? Or I've never really given it a thought. But who is responsible for sort of pushing that on everybody, or trying to push it on everybody?
One thing that has become very clear to me as I've been listening to everyone, which has been absolutely fascinating, is how much you come from countries which have much more real risks than we do sitting here in London. You've talked about Ebola, you've talked about the socio and economic and the real risk of actually surviving on a day-to-day basis in some of those cases. And I was particularly taken when you were talking about localised responses in the past. And what's noted about this response, this is one of the first pandemics that has hit us in the West. And I wonder how much you feel that the response in your countries was driven by an internationalist profile and the fact that it was so high profile and that you were forced into the discussion with the pressure from different areas, versus if you think it had happened at a regional level or a local level and what the response would have been then.
A question for Carlos. You mentioned, actually it's kind of two questions. You mentioned the commission, the government's commission for COVID-19, and you said it was an interministerial committee. I'm wondering how broad it was, how many different ministries were represented, because in principle, if you have, let's say, the economic ministry, the education ministry, the agriculture ministry, as well as the health ministry in such a committee, you might get a more balanced policy response. The possibility is there. So I'm wondering whether that happened in Guinea-Bissau, or whether economic interests, farmers' interests, maybe the Ministry of, I don't know if there's a Ministry of Women's Affairs or gender, women's interests might have been represented. I mean, that has been the experience in one or two other countries, notably Cambodia, that I'm familiar with. And the second question is related to this failure of social science research that people have been talking about. You also mentioned the CREC, the risk communication and community engagement organization or subcommittee that you said you set up, which sounds like a really good and promising initiative. And I wonder whether that was a good vehicle for social scientists to participate in some way in the decision making which went on. We've heard a lot of criticism of social science, but was this something we can be a little bit optimistic about or proud of, or did it do any good?
I will go straight to the question that was being raised for me about the interministerial committee. This was built at the beginning of the pandemic, but it didn't last long. And this committee integrated the Education Ministry, the Ministry of Family and Social Cohesion, the Ministry of Economic and the Health Ministry. But people felt, and I think this was the perception of the high hierarchy of the country, like the presidency and the prime minister. They felt that on one side there was not enough cohesion of this committee, and on the other side they felt also that we got efficiency problem with this committee. So they quickly changed this committee and they created a high commission for COVID. I even felt that it was interesting because they didn't say High Commission against COVID, they say High Commission for COVID. So to me there's
interesting.
But anyway, this commission was, in my mind, more efficient than the committee. Okay, the committee was guided by the Ministry of Economic. Okay, which was, to my mind, not a good decision. But anyway, this committee was eliminated and they created this High Commission for COVID-19.
Who guided this? Who guided the High Commission?
Sorry?
Who guided the High Commission?
The High Commission was guided by High Commissioner for COVID-19.
And it,
No, no, no. No, it was fortunately somebody, what do you call it, medical?
Doctor.
A doctor with international experience dealing with, so it was somebody who, to our mind, was a good decision. Yeah, and it was within this High Commission that we created this crack. Okay, some people coming from social science, they used their influence near the High Commissioner to create this group of social scientists and also people specialized in communication. So it was communication people with social scientists. We created this crack, but we felt all the time that this crack was not strong enough to make sure that his voice could be heard. So, and I think the reason why this High Commission didn't had the impact that it should have was because they didn't hear so much the social scientists and the specialists in communication. So this was more or less.
But it's interesting because you say that basically it was, you managed to found it because of social and political capital of the social scientists already close to government, and that was very important.
Yeah.
Thank you, Carlos. Dipanshu.
Okay, there are, I think, with the points that were covered in the questions asked, I think there are 2-3 major issues which I also feel that for the conversations we're having post these discussions would help feed in. On Wellington's point on the stratification of work or the larger informal landscape in which a country like India or many others are engulfed, how would the pandemic sort of play a role in affecting those? So one of the sort of dualistic conceptual pillars that has been entrenched in much of the literature, unfortunately economists are like pretty much guilty of perpetrating that for a long time, is that the formal informal linkages are working outside spectrum, which they don't. In reality, if you look at any local market, our initial work from 2013 was for 3 years in Cambodia and India on weekly markets. And this was where we, the work is published across like 7-8 different studies in journal articles, which of course, by the way, took 2 years for acceptance because the conceptualization of having an inclusive framework of urban informal linkages is not so well established. Ananya Roy and a few others have done that work in Kolkata, but it's not still part of the mainstream discussion. So many people feel that, why is this coming in a way? I mention that because the role of that duality is also pervasive in the policy making spectrum, which is to say that you have to do something to either formalize the informal space, which is this informal space, or in other words, do something about this before it starts affecting us, which is the period. So on the question of why lockdowns were really happening, there's no universal definition of lockdowns in place. So the Indian lockdown, which I'm telling you, is a curfew. It's a military curfew. Mm-hmm. And then in another country where there's a lockdown happening, like in Britain, because I visited London, I could go for a run, I could just do some, I don't know, you can jog, you can do your outside activity. None of those things was possible. You're getting caned by a policeman by just standing on the road. 3 times I was caned because I was talking to some worker and you would be just hit. Doesn't matter. You have to show a pass. The pass has to come from the Ministry of Home Affairs, which has no way or mechanism by which they would. So you can imagine if a person standing in a kurta pajama is going to be hit like that, what would be happening to someone who's really in the lines of margin. So the lockdowns were ensured in the initial 2020 path because 2 reasons. First, something had to be done. The very much established elite class was that this can't spread to our residential gateway colonies. You have to do something about it. For the same reason that when a flooding of airport happens, it's in the news. But a local railway station gets flooded, It's not in the news. I'm talking about the Indian context here. I'm not talking about the scenario here. Why I'm mentioning this is because the urban informal linkages are so deeply entwined, which is what was realized in the example I was saying in those 3 weeks. Nobody wanted to share that care work responsibility. The urban elite male said in the culture of patriarchy, this I can't do, right? The woman in the house said, I can't do my job and you cannot expect me to do it, so let's get the domestic worker back. But when she comes inside the house, there are masks, there's sanitizers, there's everything. There's a whole army of people that were created just so that the labor or workers which were coming in were sanitized. You have images of people sanitizing them with spirits. I think sir would know. Now, why is this critical? Because the localized responses for mitigation strategy in a country as populated, as diverse and as heterogeneous and as stratified and as unequal as India is community built and community managed. The mechanisms of mitigation are it's all on the local community. Why do you think someone is walking 12 hours on the road from the city to go to a native village town? Because they know there is a village community which will take care of me if something goes amiss or something goes wrong. They know for a fact there's no one here to listen to me. That's where I was asking about locating agency here. The agency needs to locate or be located back to the people who are providing. I think technology is doing a great job. Definitely. Fintech it's picked up very well in India. There's access to finance, women entrepreneurs, as even street vendors are able to raise capital. There is much more agency now with the gig economy where the plight of workers who are delivering food can be brought out more clearly because there are more recording, there's more service that's happening. That has its own flip side on data security and one of those things. I'm not saying that those are not issues, but it's you have nothing and you have something which you have to work with. So mitigation strategies have to be thought about and studied well. And finally, what is, I think, coming as part of the discussion somewhere is the political spectrum is apathetic largely to the marginalized community for the simple reason that's not where the private capital lies, which helps you get the votes. It's as simple as that. If you don't listen to a financial business elite community which is saying they're going to put their investment outside the space, and which is where decoupling from China was being talked about. Lockdowns weren't really working well, and that was something where it really blew up. And specific areas in Tamil Nadu were identified for investment locations to be put in for manufacturing-related investment, because the government said, we're going to secure and make sure that your investment is safe here, and the workers coming in will not have those restrictions in place. So much of the state which was employing later on lockdown strategies were doing so to ensure that the investment landscape is also not getting disrupted to a certain extent where jobs, employment might be hit. And I think that's where the balance between livelihood were managed well by states like Tamil Nadu, I would say, or Himachal Pradesh, or Goa, because the state government was cognizant. But that's not where decisions were being made. It was largely the Union Home Ministry.
Thank you. Eileen.
I was analyzing the intersectional approach about race, gender, and also class. Definitely, those who could not stay at home, in my analysis, were the African descendant women that have more risks to be to get the COVID-19. So this kind of analysis showed that Afro-descendant people in Cartagena, especially women, face a high employment rate and have less access or chance of accessing job in good conditions. So most of them were working at the beaches, for example, as selling fruits and hairdressers and other kinds of work and jobs. And I think like these kinds of measures, in kinds of thinking beyond or taking measures beyond, it's important to analyze in touristic areas how disproportionately are the benefits of tourism, because there is like an idealization of touristic area that thinks that the benefits in terms of economic and high incomes go proportionally to everyone. So when the mayor and also the government took the decision to lock down and close different touristic areas, they led the big hotels to open and the big restaurants to be open, but those local markets and those places where most of poor people used to sell their food in an informal way, they was not allowed. So I think also there are different kinds of issues that we haven't discussed, and maybe in Latin American countries people have started to discuss. It's about the climate change, for example, and how we can think about food sovereignty in terms of if something happens next, if something happens later, how we can address this. So many countries and many cities have started to implement climate change issues, and also how people in communities can start to survive with their own local market without the needs to be attached to other kinds of national markets or international markets. And the kinds of wealth distribution, for example, and the democratization of the health system. In the case of Colombia, for example, not everyone had access to the healthcare system. So in terms of analyzing the next or future things or future crises that we can face, health systems have to be in the middle of the discussions and the debates. How we can think about put in a democratic way the access of healthcare system, how to rethink the neoliberal ways of thinking about the health issues and health system things. And finally, something about where the measures came from. In my case, in Cartagena, the militarizations of our neighborhood was a measure that was decided by the national government and implemented by the local government in a racist way. In the issues like the militarization measures that came from the national government were just for the public market, for the markets, but the local government decided to put police officers and militarizations in the neighborhood. That decision was a local decision. So that's how we can analyze how the national measures went and how the local institution analyze the measures to spread the exclusions and inequalities.
Thank you, everybody. I mean, there's so much to say. I think, one of the things that comes across powerfully is the role of communities in many different ways, and community-based healthcare. Wellington was talking about the Almaty Declaration. That's, we've learned that must be part of the future, not only, of course, for health, but also economics and how they intersect. Everybody's hungry.